I am very happy and glad to introduce our speaker for today. Joining us today is Dr. Amarilys Estrella, who is an assistant professor of anthropology and a faculty affiliate for the Center for African and African American Studies and the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Rice University. She holds a PhD in sociocultural anthropology and a master's in Latin American and Caribbean studies from New York University. Her research interests broadly focus on the intersections of race and gender with transnational movements, Black Latin America and Latinx identity, as well as human rights and anti-racist activism. Her first book project investigates how Blackness and Black identity is produced, employed, and transformed through everyday encounters among stateless Black grassroots activists of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. Dr. Estrella is currently working on an edited book volume with Dr. Melissa Maldonado Salcedo, which seeks to explore and engage the many voices of mujerismos, disrupting the silences and making visible the ways in which genealogies of power get mapped through and because of the body. She is also a founding member of We Are All Dominican, a collective of graduate students, educators, scholars, artists, activists, and community members of Dominican and Haitian descent, who joined forces in October 2013 to denounce the Dominican Constitutional Tribunal's decision, which stripped the nationality of more than 4 generations of Dominicans of Haitian descent. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Estrella this afternoon, and I'm so happy that you're here.
Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining, and a special thank you to the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Program, the Africana Research Center, Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and of course Bill and Karina for the invitation. So to get started, I'm going to just share my screen. Okay, and I'll just put this in presentation mode. Can you see that, Karina? Can I get a thumbs up? Yes, okay, yes. Thank you. So my talk is based on a work in progress, which is part of my larger book project titled Recognizing Blackness, Grassroots Human Rights Activism Against Racism in the Dominican Republic. And this larger research project, I investigated, as you heard in my bio, human rights discourse, gender, and the salience of Blackness as a global racial marker, through which engaging emerging transnational social movements are redefining and contesting hegemonic anti-Black discourses in Latin America and the Caribbean. And as noted, specifically examine how Blackness and Black identities are produced, employed, and transformed through everyday encounters among Black Dominican activists of Haitian descent who have been rendered stateless in the Dominican Republic. And as you can see, the title of my talk today is Interrogating Intimacies, Black Feminist Desahogos, and Anti-Racist Activism. So I wanted to talk more about this particular aspect of my work. And as I was working on this research, I really found myself trying to go deeper into the gender dimensions of this work. Much like the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, the Reconocido movement, which I spent most of my time conducting ethnographic research with between 2016 and 2018, was led by Black women who were the faces of the movement in the media. And they were often the ones who were most vilified as well. And I noticed that they were engaging in a lot of labor related to the movement, but also a lot of emotional labor. And what it felt like their issues and the questions which most directly affected them as Black identified women were usually cast aside for this larger struggle for Dominican citizenship and recognition. And so I thought it was important to think about how they, as racialized and gendered subjects, were specifically experiencing denationalization. So in this talk, I'm exploring specifically how Black Dominican women of Haitian descent are creating spaces of love and care and redefining intimacy for one another through their activism, despite their experiences of gender-based violence. So in this talk, I pay particular attention to the everyday negotiations that Black Dominican women within the Reconocido movement face as they fight against systemic racism. And, oops, that went too far along. Okay, here we go. So in the second slide, I want to just start by sharing a bit about the movement itself. The Reconocido movement was founded in 2011, and this is as the result of political organizing to respond to the members' experiences as Black Dominicans of Haitian descent who were being retroactively denationalized through a series of rulings and policies where any dark-skinned Black Dominican that administrative officials thought looked Haitian or had French-sounding last names became suspicious. And while there are organizations that were addressing the marginalization experienced by Dominicans of Haitian descent dating back to the 80s, Reconocido is often thought of as the first large-scale movement that's led by Black Dominicans of Haitian descent that are directly affected by these policies. And so this issue gained global attention in 2013 when the Constitutional Tribunal in the Dominican Republic rules that Dominicans of Haitian descent, who were the children of Haitian migrants, considered to be in the country in transit. So the parents were considered to be in transit, despite their long history in the country, are being told that they should have never been granted citizenship, and therefore they can be retroactively denationalized. And so this ruling impacts more than 4 generations of Dominicans of Haitian descent, and this is often what then becomes referred to as la sentencia, the ruling itself. And so on this slide, you can see the Reconocido logo. I included a map of the different zones where the Reconocido movement is working, and you can see the color dots on there show exactly what regions they're in, and then a reference to the ruling itself. So in this next slide, I wanted to share this timeline that shows you the legal and juridical rulings that extend way further back than 2013, right? So oftentimes people think of 2013 as the moment in which this process of denationalization happens, but what we see is that it's been a series of policies and legal juridical rulings specifically that are retroactively denationalizing Dominicans of Haitian descent. So these xenophobic and racist policies, based on the concerns over Haitian immigrants and their Dominican-born children, led to progressively denying children of Haitian migrants access to their birth certificates, as well as national identification and electoral cards that are often referred to as a cédula. So beginning in the 2000s, a series of laws, administrative procedures within the Central Electoral Board, and these juridical rulings increasingly limit the rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent to access their Dominican identity documents. In this slide, I've included this timeline where you can see these different procedures and rulings. And so I'll share a little bit about what's happening during this time. So in 2004, we have a migration law that is passed and changes the definition of in transit. So until 2004, Dominicans of Haitian descent enjoyed a constitutional right to Dominican nationality through birthright citizenship. So born on Dominican territory to parents who resided in the country for periods far in excess of 10 days, they were legally exempt from the in-transit provision that usually applied to the children of diplomats or tourists born during visits to the country. This means that from the 1950s through the 90s, the Dominican state is formally recognizing as citizens a significant number of Dominicans of Haitian descent. And many Haitian migrants were able to use their Haitian nationality documents in order to register the births of their children. So with this new migration law, which is called Migration Law 285-04, what we see is that non-residents would now be considered in transit as well. So these non-residents include now migrants who've been in the country for 20, 30 years. So in addition to regulating the entry, stay, and employment of immigrants, the law effectively puts an end to the automatic right of Dominican nationality granted to Dominicans of Haitian descent. And I want to note that this law was highly contested and led to a landmark judgment against the Dominican Republic by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And the ruling affirmed that these policies discriminated against Dominicans of Haitian descent and left them vulnerable to statelessness. So a very famous case, Dilcia Jan and Violeta Bosico versus Dominican Republic, was brought by 2 young girls of Haitian descent who were denied Dominican birth certificates, even though their mothers were both born in the Dominican Republic and possessed valid cédulas. And in this judgment, the Inter-American Court found that the Dominican Republic was misapplying the in-transit constitutional exception. But this did not stop administrative officials from issuing administrative memos and procedures which continue to deny Dominicans of Haitian descent access to their identity documents. The denial of documents was based on potentially suspect, quote unquote, suspect documents because their parents were Haitian, or other forms of irregularities issued in the issued documents. So they started saying there are things that are off with these documents. We need to investigate further. So just to show that even though there was this Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruling, these procedures continue internally in the country. In 2010, then we see a revised national constitution, which now officially excludes an additional group from the birthright clause, which is the children of undocumented residents. So in practice, really, what I want to note is that there were ways in which there were children born before 2010 were already being denied Dominican citizenship. But this new constitution basically made these unlawful practices that I just described become permissible. So all of a sudden, we no longer have birthright citizenship as it was understood prior to 2010. So what we see is that these practices are extending over time. There are strategic litigation that's going on through community organizations. And this is what then leads to the sentencia in 2013. And so that the sentencia in 2013 becomes this, gains a lot of international attention because of how egregious it seems to retroactively denationalize individuals. Because of this international attention, we get Law 169-14, which is the last law that I'm listing here. And this law is passed in response to La Sentencia, and it's supposed to restore nationality to affected individuals. But what it does instead, it divides Dominicans into group A and B and provides differential treatment based on whether or not at some point you could prove that you had some kind of identity document or not. And so at the time of birth, even if the government believed it was erroneous, you had a document, and that now allows you to argue for the restoration of your documents. In practice, we're seeing, though, that it's not actually happening in that way, and both individuals who are being categorized as group A and individuals categorized as group B are in this legal limbo. So given this context that I've provided, I wanted to pay closer attention to how Black Dominican women of Haitian descent who are at the forefront of this movement are creating space to share their personal stories. And some of the questions I wanted to ask were, how are Black Dominican women of Haitian descent within these movements shaping and redefining intimate spaces? And how are they potentially transforming community relationships for Black women involved in activist spaces? And what I suggest is that through their activism, Black Dominican women of Haitian descent are developing new forms of engaging with one another that lead them to interrogate their intimate relationships with themselves, romantic partners, religious spaces, their communities, and the movement itself. So by engaging in local and transnational encounters where they share their stories and build with other women, Black Dominican women of Haitian descent are reimagining and transforming intimate relationships on a personal and communal level. So by taking a closer look at the role of the Reconocido movement in challenging gender roles and intimate partner violence, I highlight the myriad responses that emerge out of Black women's encounters with one another. So I begin by highlighting how intimacy in the form of sexual and reproductive ties are regulated by the Dominican state through the bodies of Black Dominican women of Haitian descent. I then explore how these regulations lead to intimate encounters between the state and Black women's bodies, and in turn, how the state's regulations of Black women's bodies leads to their regulation within their homes and community. Finally, I explore how Black Dominican women participating in these local, national, and regional spaces are supporting the development of a transnational Black political identity, which in turn challenges and questions the larger goals of their movement. I also want to note that there are discussions of gender-based violence in the stories shared by the movement's members, which were part of a writing project that turned into their first book of personal stories called Nos Cambió la Vida. And this is just an image of the book, so I'll be referring to stories from this book during this talk. So by discussing these excerpts from this book, I'm seeking to center the stories of Black women activists who are writing and theorizing from the flesh, as Sherry Moraga would say. I'm also drawing on Gloria Anzaldua's exhortations that as women of color, we face our demons in the process of writing. Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic, and Black feminists Ochi Curiel and Yuderkis Espinosa's scholarship focusing on decolonial feminisms. So in this talk, excuse me, I refer to intimacy as the connections that emerge through affect, feeling, and sensation, based on Pamela Moss and Courtney Donovan's definition in their book Writing Intimacy in Feminist Geography. In considering the role of a wide range of encounters, I engage feminist critiques that have long sought to challenge the dichotomy between public and private, noting how intimacy belongs to both domains. Lisa Lowe unsettles the dominant notion of intimacy as a possession of the individual by asking us to consider, and I'm quoting here, scenes of close connection in relation to a global geography that one more often conceives in terms of vast spatial distances, end quote. In other words, intimacy is shaped by and helps shape a variety of spatial scales, from the domestic, the local, the urban, and the national to the global. So examining intimacy across these spatial scales is relevant when considering how racialized subjects, such as Black Dominican women of Haitian descent within the Reconocido movement, are transforming and challenging the disciplining of gendered subjectivity and desire in relation to the state, community, and their homes. Understanding how intimacy permeates activist spaces and relationships from the individual to the collective allows us to understand how Black women are engaging with one another, and in the process, interrogating taken for granted understandings of intimacy and its role in activist spaces. I also explore Audre Lorde's use of the erotic as a source of power through which these intimate relationships might be theorized. Lorde states, and I quote, "The erotic is a source within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling," end quote. And to be clear, as Adrienne Marie Brown notes, the feminine here is not in association with the biological, but something that all bodies can tap into. Women have been taught to shy away from the erotic, as it has been misconstrued as giving way to sensation that stem from the irrational. Yet, as Lorde points out, and I quote, "The erotic provides the power which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person. The sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them, and lessens the threat of their difference," end quote. So Black women of Haitian descent actively organizing against statelessness are able to summon the power of the erotic to imagine new forms of engaging with one another and their movement. But I want to first talk about how the state regulates intimacy, and particularly Black women's bodies in the Dominican Republic. So this section is called "The Gender Dimensions of Statelessness, Regulating Black Women's Bodies." And Mark B. Padilla et al. Have noted, and I'm quoting here, that because theoretical discussions of globalization are concerned with political, economic, technological, and cultural transformations on a broad scale, they have frequently failed to articulate how these large-scale processes are embodied and experienced, or how they come to influence the most intimate aspects of one's life, end quote. We must therefore understand denationalization and the resulting statelessness crisis in the Dominican Republic as part of larger globalizing processes, which have led to the development of technologies of surveillance and the affective governance of relationships for the sake of securing national borders. While scholars examining the impact of La Sentencia have noted the geopolitical implications for the Dominican state and its non-citizen subjects, less attention has been paid to how the lack of identity documents, socioeconomic depression, and social exclusion are transforming and potentially creating new forms of intimacy for Dominicans of Haitian descent, and particularly Black Dominican women of Haitian descent. So Marino Vinicio Castillo, or Vincho, as many know him, is the founder of a right-wing political party called the Fuerza Nacional Progresista, FNP, and was quoted as saying that Haitians are using the invasion of the uterus through their, end quote there, through their pregnant women as a method for the occupation of Dominican territory. So anti-immigrant rhetoric and fears of Haitian invasion are often gendered by stoking fears of pregnant immigrant women whose children will one day take over the nation. And in this slide, I have shared screenshots of just two examples of newspapers which have focused on the growing number of Haitian immigrant women. In both articles, they use a stock photo of dark-skinned Black women, which automatically associates darker-skinned women with foreignness. And the images in these two articles are from 2020 and early 2021. But since then, the government led by current President Luis Abinader has created a resolution that prohibits foreign women who are more than 6 months pregnant from entering the country. And it was argued that this was meant as a solution to prevent pregnant migrant women from becoming a financial burden to the country. Civil society organizations have reported that since these measures were taken, immigration officials have been detaining and deporting pregnant migrant women during the routine visits for medical care. So such fears of this takeover in the Dominican Republic were evident and documented as early as 1969, when the director of migration at the time wrote a memorandum to the President Joaquin Balaguer, in which the subject line was exposition on the grave problem caused to the country by the great number of Haitians living in our territory. So in this slide, what you're seeing is on the right side, two right-wing nationalists, former President Balaguer and Vicho Castillo, as well as an image of that memorandum that shows just how far back this stretches in terms of these concerns. So for decades, the Dominican government sought to challenge the nationality rights of children born to Haitian migrant parents. However, it would take another 35 years from the date of this memorandum for legal actions to be taken. And that's the 2004 General Law on Migration 285-04 that I mentioned earlier. So when this law was passed, it regulated the entry and employment of foreigners in the country, and it also sought to end jus solis, the right to soil guaranteed by the Dominican Constitution at the time, as I mentioned, by expanding its definition of in transit to include children born to non-resident foreign mothers, right? It does it takes effect. So under Migration Law 285-04, all children that are born to foreign mothers must be handed a pink birth certificate, or it's called a Certificado de Nacido Vivo, which states that it basically certifies the live birth, and then is registered in the Foreign Registry book. So this child is registered in what's called El Libro de Extranjeros, the Book of Foreigners. And although the current constitution promulgated in 2010 made these practices constitutional by redefining Dominican nationality, it continues to state that at least one parent must be of Dominican nationality in order for a child to be recognized as a Dominican national. In practice, however, the administrative staff of hospitals hold major discretion when determining whether or not they will be providing the mother with a white or pink certificate. And this is often based on their own perceptions of the mother's race and ethnicity. So in other words, whether or not the biological father is Dominican oftentimes becomes irrelevant, as hospital staff are often determining whether or not a child will get the documentation necessary to register their birth within the Dominican Civil Registry offices solely based on whether the mother looks Haitian or not. So these sentiments were shared by Charlene, who is one of the activist members who participated in the writing workshops, which led to the publication of the book Nos Cambió la Vida. It transformed, our lives transformed, and I'll talk a little bit more about the book in a bit. And she states, during the workshop and in the story, During the workshop and in the story, published, Charlene talks about her experience after giving birth to her daughter, Rosalyn, and I'm quoting now. When I was discharged, they did not want to let me leave from the Antonio Musa Hospital because I did not allow them to register my daughter in the Book of Foreigners. I wanted them to register my daughter in the normal book because my child did not belong to another country, because she is from where she is born. That's where she belongs, end quote. So Charlene had enlisted the help of Reconocidos leaders to help her demand that her child be given the proper documentation. And Charlene expressed her gratitude for the movement in the final words of her story by thanking them for, quote, transforming her life by not allowing that criminal sentencia to end her life and her future, end quote. And that's why the title of her story is Thank You, Reconocido, for Changing My Life. So it was experiences such as Charlene's that led Altagracia John Joseph, a Dominican lawyer of Haitian descent, who was also directly impacted and actively fighting against statelessness, To tell historian April Mays that la sentencia tiene cara de mujer. La sentencia has a woman's face. Situations such as Charlene's were common and were one of the questions families most often reached out to Reconocido to for answers. Then I remember one particular afternoon, Angela, who's one of the movement's leaders, answered a phone call in which a father with Dominican identity documents was unsure of his ability to register his daughter's birth. In this case, the mother was Haitian. She was a Haitian migrant woman. And as Angela hung up and told me about the story, she laughed and she mentioned to those of us in the room, and I'm quoting now, "I feel as if I were in a biology course crossing different blood types," end quote. So Dominicans of Haitian descent claimed to the nation had demanded that members of the movement become experts in biogenetics who could determine what kind of racial and biological mixtures might result in the birth of a Dominican child with rights to citizenship. So such discourses demanding the control and regulation of Haitian women must be expanded and understood as encompassing Black women, whether Haitian migrants, Dominican of Haitian descent, or perceived as Haitian, as it is these bodies which are racialized and gendered in particular ways that are seen as incapable of producing proper Dominican citizen subjects. Similarly, in the United States, birth regulation and concerns over population control have been closely tied to race. During the 60s and 70s, while the mainstream feminist movement prioritized abortion rights, Black and brown women became the victims of racist policies that sought to control the number of children they chose to bear through deceitful sterilization policies. In most recent years, the concerns by conservative and right-wing politicians in the United States have led to concerns over quote-unquote anchor babies who would have access to birthright citizenship, thus allowing migrants with a regular status to remain in the United States. And I'm pointing to this because in both cases, policies driven by an impetus to control the racialized and foreign-born population and their children within the nation state must be read within a longstanding discourse of eugenics, which has prioritized controlling the reproduction of racialized women, as opposed to supporting a reproductive justice framework in which the bodily autonomy of all women is prioritized. So while in the case of the Dominican Republic, the possibilities for these quote-unquote anchor babies has been dissipated by the 2010 Constitution's elimination of birthright citizenship, the high numbers of Black foreign children being born in the Dominican Republic's hospitals, as the media reports, are being imagined as a burden for the state, which in turn is unable to fairly provide for the children of Dominican women being born in the country. Or so this is the narrative. So nationalist groups with a large following also become complicit in regulating Black women's bodies through their nationalist and racist propaganda on social media. And I'm pointing to this because in several of the images shared on a Facebook page of the right-wing group Antigua Orden Dominicana, or also referred to as Old Dominican Guard, they state, "No soy racista, soy nacionalista," which means I'm not racist, I'm a nationalist. And such assertions don't take into consideration how nation-building projects are inextricably linked to the development of racial ideology. The irony and betrayal to their anti-racist statement occurs, however, through another Facebook post where the image of a Black baby doll is displayed in representation of Haitian babies. And in that comment, the image that goes along with it says, and I'm quoting here, "While it has been instilled in our women in the Dominican Republic to not have more than 2 or 3 children, in our hospitals, thousands of these beauties," and in this case, the beauty is referencing the doll in the image, are being born daily without any kind of control. To top it all off, their mothers are transported as contraband and stay for the rest of their lives illegally. In a few years, they will be more than us, end quote. So these are the kinds of comments that are part of a larger gendered and racialized discourse within a patriarchal society that amidst the regulation and disciplining of Dominican women's bodies is part of a larger national and racial project. For Dominican nationalists, Haitian women's bodies become representative of an unregulated, un-Dominican body. Furthermore, their reproduction becomes a public concern as it is perceived as an engine for the production of illegality. Haitian women and their children become a symbol of fear as the idea that they might someday be more than us, quote unquote, imagines a darkening Dominican society. And as feminist scholars of the Dominican Republic, such as Dixa Ramirez, Gloria Garcia Peña, and Ginetta Candelario have noted, regulating Black women's bodies and reproduction has been integral to the maintenance of the boundaries of Dominican white womanhood. Ramirez notes, and I'm quoting here, that while there is more discursive room for Dominican masculinity to be associated with Blackness, proper Dominican femininity is not only codified through phenotypical whiteness or white signifiers, such as class mobility, but also through actions such as remaining indoors within the domestic realm, end quote. Black Dominican women of Haitian descent are not only being denied birth certificates for their children for not producing proper Dominican citizen subjects, but are also virulently attacked by the state, media, and society at large for not adhering to patriarchal values that demand that they remain within domestic spheres. So although, as Black feminist scholars have noted, Black women and their work and life experiences have meant that they, and thus intimacies, have historically not remained relegated to the domestic sphere, the patriarchal values of the Dominican nation continue to imagine womanhood and femininity as tied to domesticity. Many of the women in the Reconocido movement noted how their time increasingly spent outside of the home for their activist work became contentious points with their romantic partners who felt that they could no longer control them. And they were worried about the relationships and possible romantic encounters with other men, as well as women, who could negatively influence them. So in other words, although Black women have historically worked and often had no choice but to be outside of their homes, their male partners and communities exist within the confines of a patriarchal state that continues to imagine the proper role of women as domestic. And the goals and organizing work of movements such as Reconocido, it directly challenges these expectations. So how then might intimacy be theorized and reimagined in the case of Black Dominican women of Haitian descent, who are constantly being bombarded by the media and Dominican society as producing non-citizen subjects, while also experiencing the influential power of the patriarchy within their homes and religious community, which call for modesty in private dealings with regards to domestic violence. If men, both racialized and non-racialized, are participatory in the production and maintenance of power and the patriarchy, they have the ability to continue to exert control and blame over women for not doing the necessary paperwork so that their children may be recognized as Dominican nationals and citizens. This vulnerability means that they're more likely to experience intimate partner violence and find themselves without recourse. So it's within this context that women within the Reconocido movement are coming together to share their personal stories as a form of desahogo, which I define as an emotional release and a relief, in which in turn creates spaces for them to begin to redefine intimacy. So this next part of my talk that I want to share is titled Desahogos, Confronting Intimate Partner Violence. And so I want to share one of the stories in Nos Cambió la Vida that was written by Yolanda Alcino. So the book, so just to tell you a little bit more about the book, it was the culmination of a series of storytelling workshops that were designed to support the development of its young members' writing skills. It was also an opportunity for participants to share their own stories as the children of Haitian migrants who found themselves in legal limbo after being affected by the decades-long process of denationalization. So in advance of the workshop, I worked closely with the movement's leaders in the development of the application form for the workshop's selection process. And among the criteria for selection was having a minimum 8th grade level of reading and writing comprehension, direct experience with the denationalization process, and they were also looking for a balanced number of men and women. So after all the applications were received, a total number of 22 members were selected to participate. So of the 22 selected, 13 women and 6 men completed the writing workshops and had their stories published in the book. So the workshops occurred over a series of weekends beginning in June 2016, where the selected members, who were representatives of all the 6 regional areas that I showed you on the map earlier, they would travel to Santo Domingo and sleep over in Catholic retreat centers where Reconocido, through its sponsor, the Centro Bono, had built relationships with the religious clergy. So I arrived on the 3rd and final weekend of the writing workshops, and the organizers had asked me to support with note-taking, audio recording, and photography. And during my daily check-ins with the leaders prior to joining the workshop, I had already been warned that the workshops were intense. These were the words that were used to describe them. And from what Carmen, one of the movement's coordinators, would share during her lunch break, I quickly learned that this space was serving as its own form of desahogo. So again, a form of venting or emotional release, allowing moments of relief for the members as well. And it's within this context that I first heard Yolanda read her story. And I won't read the story, but Yolanda discusses her experience of physical violence with the father of her children. And I wanted to note that the stories themselves are now actually translated into English. So if you wanted to read Yolanda's story, whether you wanted to read it in Spanish firsthand or through a translation, you can go to Nos Cambió. So that's NOSCAMB.io. And this is an open access translation process that I was part of as a member of the collective We're All Dominican, along with community volunteers who worked for 2 years to try to get these stories translated. And they're now being housed at the Barnard Digital Humanities Center. And so I just want to encourage you, if you want to read any of these stories, you can go ahead and put this into your search link, and then you can enter and read all of the stories that are there. So the ones that I'm referencing and the ones that I don't reference. So just moving along to the next slide on Yolanda. So Yolanda read out loud to the group, and her tears began streaming down her face. She had tried reading her story to the group several times that weekend, but she would stop, apologize, and tell us that she could not continue. On this final day, the room was in complete silence. She stood up, and while pausing several times, Yolanda read her full story. When she finished, she sat back down in her chair, crossed her arms, and said that she hoped she would never have to tell her story again. She then rested her head on the table. The leaders of the movement who had organized the workshop had imagined that this would be an opportunity for many of its young members to discuss the difficulties experienced as stateless individuals. But what they did not imagine was that many of the stories told by the group, comprised primarily of women, would be about the family and intimate partner violence they had experienced. So, excuse me, Yolanda's ability to open up about her traumatic experience with the father of her children in the workshop was the result of concerted efforts by the leadership of the Reconocido movement to provide space to acknowledge that many of the women members were not only facing racism and gender-based violence from the state, but were confronting violence within their homes and their community. Yolanda's story was repeated several times that Saturday afternoon by other women who had similar experiences with romantic partners. As another member recalls, her family and friends would often say that she was la mala, the bad one, and that was why her partner behaved the way he did towards her. Despite their commitment to ending anti-Blackness and race-based statelessness more generally, Dominican women of Haitian descent, perhaps inadvertently at first, were also finding ways to create space within their movement to share their personal stories of survival. Gloria Saldúa exhorts us to, and I'm quoting here, write of what most links us with life, the sensation of the body, the images seen by the eye, the expansion of the psyche and tranquility, moments of high intensity, its movement, sounds, thought, end quote. And the women of the movement, I believe, were doing just that in this space. In Ansaldua's words, and I'm quoting again, to write is to confront one's demons, look them in the face, and live to write about them. She goes on to say, and I quote again, that writing is dangerous because we are afraid of what the writing reveals. The fears, the angers, the strengths of a woman under a triple or quadruple oppression. Yet in the very act lies our survival because a woman who writes has power, end quote. I would often hear bits and pieces of stories of survival about different women of the movement as I sat in the office with the movement's leaders. They usually began with an expression of amazement and pride in seeing the changes and growth a woman who was once in a difficult situation at home had experienced after joining the movement. Minerva, one of the movement's coordinators, shared with me that she couldn't believe how many women within the movement were experiencing intimate partner violence. Although surprising within the context of activist spaces where the assumption was that as outspoken women activists, they were empowered enough to resist violence, The high number of Reconocidos members who had experienced intimate partner violence coincided with a broader trend within the Dominican Republic. According to Amnesty International, official statistics for the Dominican Republic showed that the first half of 2017 saw a 21% increase in the number of killings of women and girls compared with the same period in 2016. The Dominican Republic held one of the highest rates of femicides in Latin America. The death threats and violence experienced by Black Haitian migrant women and Black Dominican women of Haitian descent are often going underreported because they lack the legal identity documents necessary to seek legal redress. So when Minerva, one of the leaders, first found out how serious the situation among the women of the movement was, she organized several meetings and workshops to discuss gender-based violence. Minerva always mentioned Nancy's particular story because she could not believe that Nancy, the Nancy that I had met and knew today, was the same one that first began participating in the movement's activities. Minerva would often say, "Cuando yo conocí a Nancy, ella ni pantalones usaba." When I first met Nancy, she did not even wear pants. Nancy's use of skirts was reference to her conservative Christian upbringing, and it was also meant to express behaviors such as shyness, quietness, and timidity. Nancy now wore pants, represented her region in the country, region of the country within the movement, and had traveled to Cuba, New York, and other parts of the Caribbean, where she was discussing Afro-diasporic connections and the impact of statelessness on Black Dominicans of Haitian descent. So I sat with Nancy at the Centro Bono office, where many of the Reconocido movement members' activities were held during the summer of 2018. And we talked about her role in the movement, how she became involved, and her future aspirations. And she had often dealt with anxiety when it came to public speaking, and she told me and spoke at length about the importance of this movement and helping her find her voice. So as we were ending the interview, I had asked Nancy if there was anything else she wanted to share. And she placed her hands on the table and paused for a second, and I'm quoting here. She says, "Within my life story in the workshop, I did not tell my story because I was a little embarrassed. Yolanda was a bit worse than mine. Like Yolanda, that was the most bitter relationship that I experienced." So Nancy had participated in the writing workshops along with Yolanda and written her own story. But unlike many of the other women, however, she did not feel ready to share particular experiences with intimate partner violence within the group. And as we sat in the office almost a year after the first writing workshop, she felt ready to share her personal experience of intimate partner violence. And as painful as her words were, and as much as she expressed the severity of the issue, she wanted me to know how thankful she was to the Reconocido movement for giving her life new meaning. And Nancy said, and I'm quoting, "Sometimes I post on Facebook that I feel free and happy. People do not understand why I say this, but this is how I feel," end quote. Nancy then laughed, and I read in Nancy's laughter a channeling of her erotic power that led to an internal sense of self-satisfaction, which in turn allowed for a sense of freedom to emerge. The writing workshop and series of activities organized by Reconocido had allowed for a space for these desahogos to emerge. And I just want to note that I actually all of the things that I'm sharing today, I had a workshop with women members of the movement, and we spent a lot of time talking about the erotic as power. And something that I'm still thinking about is how out of everyone, Nancy was the person who really, like, it really resonated for her to talk about the power of the erotic. And so it's just been really exciting to see this kind of interaction and see what they think about this kind of theorizing work that I'm doing with them. So I want to turn now to how these forms of desahogos through the telling of their personal stories have led to Black feminist desahogos in their larger organizing spaces. So April Mays argues, and I'm quoting here, "Black Dominican women of Haitian descent advocacy for immigrants' rights and anti-racist, anti-sexist citizenship constitutes Black feminist practice. Therefore, in addition to the pain, trauma, physical dislocation, and terror that La Sentencia has produced for hundreds of thousands of people, a unique political space has opened within Dominican civil society, and this space, it is argued, is Black and feminist. In a situation where it is unlikely that the current government will overturn the tribunal's decision, Black feminist activists in the DR are recreating Dominican civil society, insisting that protecting immigrants' rights requires paying attention to Black women's experience and to their demands for change," end quote. Black Dominican women of Haitian descent have brought their particular experiences into their anti-racist movements, while also reimagining intimate encounters with women inside and outside of their movement. Their stories have also meant an acknowledgement with feminist spaces that more attention must be placed on how race, class, and gender have functioned as interlocking systems of oppression. And in these spaces, the voices of Black women of Haitian descent have often been left out of larger national and transnational efforts. Transnational organizing and human rights activism have become unifying discourses for anti-racism activists seeking social justice. These movements have allowed for transformative processes that also create space for intersectional approaches and analyses to occur. Sonia Alvarez et al. Argues, and I quote, that regional encuentros have proven to be productive spaces of transformation, as well as critical sites of negotiation, providing a new modality of transborder activism, end quote. Transnational Black feminist regional meetings have played a key role in the transformation of intimate encounters between Black women, include the 1992 network of Afro-Latin American and Caribbean women that was held for the first time in Boca Chica, Dominican Republic. So Black Dominican women of Haitian descent, including the current leader of the Movimiento de Mujeres Dominico-Haitianas, MUDA, were present at this initial event and have continuously participated in these regional and international networks that have sought to insert the particular needs and concerns of Afro-descendant women in feminist spaces and discourse. The result of these encuentros was the development of the yearly celebration held on July 25th of Afro-Latin American and Caribbean women. Little documentation about what transpired during that first encounter exists. However, the development of such networks, where recognition that women of African descent throughout the region were experiencing particular forms of discrimination that required actions that could address the specificities of their marginalization as Afro-diasporic women, emerge. These ongoing transnational encuentros, as well as ongoing digital exchanges, have provided opportunities for reflection and desahogos as proof of their plight and struggle as Black Dominican women of Haitian descent. They have also provided an opportunity for the development of a transnational Black political identity to develop. In more recent years, Black feminist spaces have also been critical of the work of the United Nations and other international organizations, have sought to create global movements against gender-based violence and women's rights more generally. In discussing the importance of moving away from the agendas of international institutions, Black feminist scholar Ochi Curiel states, and I'm quoting, "We must develop autonomy away from the agendas of the United Nations and other forms of colonialist international cooperation." Even though it was an overwhelming phenomenon during the 1990s, the majority of organizations and Afro women collectives still active today rely on the UN, its world conferences, and its projects for development, which are nothing more than expressions of neoliberalism. Therefore, we must once and for all depart from these logics and push for creative, varied, and most importantly, counter-hegemonic projects against those authorized by the state, multinational corporations, and neocolonial cooperation, which perpetuates structural racism. We must create our own modes of thinking. This means destroying the binary opposition between theory and practice. To decolonize oneself entails comprehending what our foremothers already knew. Theory is the result of practice, and the production of theory is a social practice. So such calls to decolonize were being taken up by the women of the Reconocido movement through the engagement in regional Black feminist spaces. During a conversation with Minerva, she expressed excitement for her and Nancy's participation in the first school of decolonial Caribbean and feminist thought that was held with Black feminist scholars of the region, including Ochi Curiel and Yuderquis Espinosa. After one of her meetings, she anxiously shared with me one of her readings, which was a translation into Spanish of the Combahee River Collective statement. She was so excited to be engaged in readings and discussions centering the scholar of Black feminists. And she was even more excited about doing similar reading circles with women in the batallas where they lived and organized. So Minerva stated to me in talking about this excitement of being part of this Black feminist space, that she perhaps could create her own pensamiento crítico batallero, or as a collective in the batey, they were thinking about this critical thought from El Batey. And Keisha Khan-Perry notes, and I'm quoting, that these regional encounters reaffirm the idea that transnational frameworks and actions are integral to the Black women-led social justice project, end quote. And they exemplified exemplified how these interactions across different scales were involved in reimagining Black women's intimacy. So these encuentros and their impact on its participants should not be understood as unidirectional. Instead, they should be understood as an intricate web of relationships allowing Black women to see one another through their connected differences, as Audre Lorde states. Collective discussions and learnings between Black women from different parts of Latin America and the United States are impacting how Black Dominican women of Haitian descent see themselves, their Black identities, and their activism. At the same time, Black Dominican women of Haitian descent are challenging racial, color, and gender categories within these feminist spaces. So I'm almost finishing now, but I just want to talk a little bit about redefining love. So movements such as Reconocido have been born out of a need to demand identity documentation and nationality rights. However, for the women of the movement, they have come to symbolize much more than that. The movement has provided a space for the women to think and process what it means to them to be Black women and how they're fighting oppression on different fronts. Reconocido has provided the women of the movement an opportunity to interrogate their intimate partner relationships while finding joy and empowerment in supporting one another through their difficult moments. By summoning their erotic power, they were shaping deeply with one another. They were sharing deeply with one another their fears, their exhaustion, and reclaiming joy and love for themselves and each other. There were daily practices that might have seemed mundane, but also become deep expressions of love. For example, upon seeing each other, they would often comment how beautiful they were. They would say, "You look beautiful, that lipstick looks good on you, I feel proud of you." And these became affirmations that the women of the movement constantly shared with one another. They would bring each other fruits, food, clothing, flowers, and other items when they expected to see one another. And they often shared in laughter, hugs, and the occasional crying. They would dress up and wear their finest to hang out around one another and check in on their sisters in the struggle whenever they were worried about one of the women's silence or lack of participation. Through their relationships to one another, Black women of Haitian descent are shaping and redefining intimate spaces and potentially transforming community relationships and ideas about human rights and activism. These intimate encounters also meant telling it like it is when they felt that one of them was not effectively addressing the demands of their role within the movement. After all, intimacy was also about building the confidence and trust of one another to call each other out when there was concern over their lack of presence, motivation, or participation in a meeting or event. It allowed for them to speak about the movement's concerns, as well as concerns over personal matters that the women might have been experiencing with their families, neighbors, and themselves. It was also the motivation for creating a specific project, Muñecas Negras, Black Dolls, which you can also find by going to the website for Reconocido. And this really allowed them to think about what are the other issues that they wanted to discuss that were impacting them with regards to statelessness and documentation as women. The leaders understood that these issues were intricately linked, but as one of the leaders told me, we need to create spaces outside of their homes and family routines for these women. Fighting a racist heteropatriarchal system on so many scales was exhausting work. Ensuring that the Black women of the Reconocido movement knew that they were loved was at the foundation of sustaining such work. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to stop there and just thank everyone for listening, for joining, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Questions for you. The first one is, I don't know if this is a program or a project, but were there any like trickle down effects of the project from people that were not like actual participants, but were like family or friends of the participants? And the second question is, I guess related to that, were there any positive or negative unintended consequences of women's participation in this project or program?
Thank you for those questions. So I guess one exciting thing that I didn't get to talk about is that because this first round of the book was so successful in the sense that it was really a moment that the members felt they needed to have, because what's happened with a lot of what's happening in the Dominican Republic around statelessness is that scholars who have gone to the country are writing about the issue, and they've been welcomed by the movements. They want people to know what's happening outside of the Dominican Republic, but so much of it unfortunately hasn't actually made it back to the communities as far as what's been written. And so what the book project itself was seeking to do was, one, have people tell their own stories, right? Write about what they've experienced, but also make that be something that's available to their families, to their friends. So when they did the launching of the book, it was a big event where they were able to invite both members of the community, but also people in the country who've been interested in these issues. The exciting thing has been that they've created a second book, which has a new cohort of members of the movement, and some of those folks in the second cohort are actually siblings of the folks in the first cohort, or related in some way, or have come to the movement based on the experience of the writing project. So I guess that's one positive, exciting thing that has happened. And the idea of the collective that I'm part of in the US, we're a Haitian and Dominican diaspora collective that has really sought to amplify the voices of Dominicans of Haitian descent, and particularly these stories that were in that first book. And so what we're hoping is that by participating in events, being in different panels, letting people know about the translation of the book, we're also expanding the audience for it and who's learning about these stories that exist. The negative effects is that there are ultranationalists. There are very strong right-wing movements in the country who continue to push for policies that continue to disenfranchise Dominicans of Haitian descent, and there's xenophobic and racist policies that are in place. And one of the things that a lot of the members of the movement and civil society organizations thought would happen is that with the shift in new political party and government, which has been in place for the last almost 2 years, that there would be some positive effects, right? So that there would be support for the restoration of the rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent. But instead, what we're seeing is a sort of pushback, and it's getting a lot of attention in terms of ultranationalists who. It might not sound very different from what you're hearing here, but for example, another book that was done was a children's book by the movement members, and that children's book is now being it's getting a lot of attention as a book that's potentially dangerous to Dominican children, because it pushes this idea of Haitian ethnicity and multiculturalism as being part of the nation, and they don't want that, right? So, and it kind of sounds like our conversations around critical race theory here and how people are imagining what this means for children also. So there is a lot of pushback. I would be remiss if I didn't say that. But there's a lot of excitement also and support from folks in the diaspora and in the Dominican Republic who are really trying to think about new narratives. How do we talk about being of African descent? How do we talk about Blackness in the Dominican Republic?
Thank you, Amarilys. I'm going to send you a question. I'm Haitian native, so I'm curious about the collective that you're a part of, and looking forward to looking at the translated version of these stories online. Thank you.
Yes, and we're really excited. And our hope is that at some point we can get them into Creole also. So we're really looking forward to that.
That's tough because my work is in rural areas, but most of them can't read what I would perhaps give back. So it's been a bit tough, but I'm glad that you're trying to also translate it back to Haitian Creole as well. Thank you.
Yes. And I know we're running out of time, but something that what you just said reminded me of is that one of the wishes of the group and folks in general have said some sort of audio version of it would also be great to have. And so it's something that we're hoping we can also work on.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll put my email in the chat just so that if you wanted to reach out, I'm happy to talk more.
Thank you, Gloria, for the questions. Anyone else have any questions? And Bill, you can.
Yeah, we have a question here.
Okay.
From the audience. And I have one.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Estrella. It was pretty interesting to get to know this project. And I wonder if you either people who would like to participate in a way, like, for example, writers who would like to organize like some workshops for these women, or Is that possible? Are you open to this participation?
So I think that, thank you for the question. And I what I would say is that there have definitely been a lot of opportunities for collaboration with the Reconocido movement, but also other movements within the country and organizations who are being led by Dominicans of Haitian descent. And so it's been a matter of connecting to the organizations and the movements and seeing where they're finding a need and thinking about what does that collaboration look like. So I know of many scholars and students who've been interested, who've been able to reach out. I would encourage to do that through the Reconocido website and their Facebook page. And also, if at any point you wanted to reach out to me, I'm happy to discuss further and finding ways of connecting you or whoever might be interested.
Thank you so much. I will contact you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
If I had a question, which is looking at the photos, I noticed in the group photo at the end of the book session, there were some men in the photo and they weren't appearing in the other photo with the women in the circle and under the hangar. So I was wondering what the role of those men were in that.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So I should say the images weren't, so the images at the end were from another event that was held after the workshops were done. But the workshops included men, and I believe I said there were 6 of them. And so they're part of these spaces in that initial workshop. What's happened is that they have also now created additional spaces for women identified members to be part of that are separate from the workshop. But a lot of what has come out of those spaces comes from having a workshop where it wasn't necessarily just about women. It just happened to be that the experiences of women were as one way that it was explained to me was, we thought this was going to be a workshop where people were just going to say, I went to the Junta Central Electoral, which is the Central Electoral Board, and and then they're going to talk about what it felt like to be denationalized through these engagements with the state. But what happens is that a lot of the stories in the book then talk about either intimate partner violence or the sort of tensions that emerge within the family, or the difficulties of being women in particular within their communities, right? And at no point do I mean to have these things disconnected from one another, right? What's happening at the local, the global, the national, right? I'm trying to say that these are all influencing one another. But it seems like there was this expectation that it would just be about the engagement with the state. And what so many of them were saying was, we want to talk about what's happening within our families as well, and what our roles are in that space. And so these men were there, and you can read the stories. Theirs don't sound like many of the women's stories. I mean, they're important, and they talk about their own roles, right? And their own experiences. But what I think was important was that they were part of it as well, and that there have been ways in which they've tried to engage in these conversations and see why this is important to the movement itself as a whole. I hope that answers the question.
I wonder if they had heard stories like that themselves already, or if this was the first time they heard them.
My sense is that they knew some of these stories. I don't know how much of it was publicly aired or created, or how much space had been created for them. It almost seemed like some of the stories were sort of just there, almost like waiting to come to the surface. And that this space of writing and the workshops that they were holding with their writing facilitator was actually allowing for some of that to come to the surface.
Well, Karina, we have until 2:15, so if you want to ask if there are any more questions in the audience, the virtual audience.
Sure. Virtual audience, anybody else have any questions for Professor Estrella about the project or work?
Yes, not.
I had one question, I guess, and
Mhm.
I don't really know. Anyway, I'll just ask the question, which was I was looking at the map and right, I noticed like it was like Santo Domingo, what we call El Este, y El Sur.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering if you know of anything happening like in the northern region, or particularly like that the area by La Linea, which you know is like right by the Bon border, which is like where this whole border
Yeah.
wall is happening.
Yes.
So yes.
Okay, so let me let me try to give a condensed, concise response to that. So what's happening is that what you're seeing in the map is some of the historically were some of the biggest sugarcane ingenios plantations were, right? And so historically this is where you have the batalles, which is the sugarcane communities, and then this is where you have generations of Dominicans of Haitian descent, right? That this is where you get the multiple generations and experiences of Dominicans of Haitian descent who are directly tied to the batalles. So when asking the Reconocido movement, a lot of their work happens to be there because this is where you have the greatest concentration in the South and the East, right? But this doesn't mean that there aren't Dominicans of Haitian descent all over the country, right? That there are Dominicans of Haitian descent in these other areas. But when I was there during those years and since then, there have been conversations around how do we support more organizing work in these other parts of the country. So what has been voiced or what I've understood is that there are Dominicans of Haitian descent in all of these places, particularly if you think about the North, Puerto Plata, for example. There are organizations also in Mao that are working. They're not, the Reconocido movement collaborates, but is not there. But there is like a lot of effort to organize these other areas of the country. It has been harder. It has been more challenging, and there are different theories around that, including just the kind of repression that and violence that communities have met in these other regions of the country, which have worked as a deterrent as well in terms of the organizing. And so I don't have a full understanding or a complete picture of it all, but these are some of the some of what I heard and some of what I saw as initiatives to try to strengthen the work, and especially in the North. Yes, so I'll leave it at that.